Welcome back to Tabletop Titans and another Titan Tactics. Today we're going to be discussing the secondary changes in the Arks of Omen GT pack. There are some sweeping changes here, a number of nerfs, a number of buffs, and a number of secondaries that have been removed. So this is going to be your guide to all things secondaries, discussing what's changed and what the state of the game is right now. One of the big changes to secondaries in Arks of Omen is the reduction and the streamlining in a number of them. If you're a book that has 4 secondaries in it, you're likely going to have them reduced down to 3. And if you're a Space Marine that has their own expansion book, unfortunately, they're going to be reduced down to a single bespoke secondary. You can still use the Space Marine ones, and you can still use all the generic ones, but it's definitely going to be a learning curve as we adjust to this new world. In addition to reducing secondaries, there's been a number of core secondaries that encourage you to take troops, armigers, and war dogs. There are 3 secondaries in which, if you complete them with these units, you're going to get an extra command point. This is Assassination, Grind Them Down, and Behind Enemy Lines. Pretty interesting. I don't know if it's going to really affect list design, but when it happens, it's going to be fantastic. Psychic Interrogation is a powerful and ever-changing secondary, the current version of which is now going to require you to have line of sight, but not in the way that you think. The target of the action must be visible to the caster. The reason they've done this, of course, is to allow for things like Mortarion and Chaos Knights to actually be able to continue to pour into the secondary, keeping within the same spirit, which is, can you see your target? I think it's a really interesting and smart adjustment that they've done here, but they ultimately have really curtailed this powerful secondary, so people are going to have to adjust whether or not they're including this in their list design. Engage in All Fronts sees a little bit of a revamp, and I think this is a good change. There are now 2 ways of scoring it. If you're attempting to score it by being in 3 table quarters, you still have to be at least 6 inches from every other table quarter, and that's going to give you 2 victory points. However, if you're trying to score in 4 quarters, you now only have to be beyond 3 inches of each other table quarter, and this is going to give you 3 victory points. This is really going to help a lot of armies that aren't able to completely dive into the backfield each and every turn, slow plotting armies that can get to the midfield, but maybe not the enemy's deployment zone. I think it's an elegant change and is really going to encourage people to take this secondary that was once so prevalent and now pretty rarely taken. Next up, we have Behind Enemy Lines, a really powerful secondary, and pretty interesting that they decided to actually buff this. Behind Enemy Lines now gives you 3 victory points for having a single unit in your enemy's deployment zone at the end of your turn. This is up from 2 previously, and you still get 4 points if you manage to have 2 units in your enemy's deployment zone at the end of your turn. That's it for changes to the core secondaries. Now we're going to look at the many faction secondaries, and really here is where we see a number of the changes and diversification of our options. Space Marines see a couple of adjustments to their secondaries, all in their favor. Codex Warfare is finally maybe playable. Now when you can get a kill in Devastator Doctrine, it's going to give you 2 victory points instead of 1. Additionally, there's no cap on the number of kills you can get within each doctrine. So you can do them all in Tactical, all in Devastator, all in Assault. Whatever your army wants to do, you can now accomplish it. And don't forget, this is combined with the fact that you now no longer have to progress from one doctrine to another. So it's a huge boon to this secondary. I think ultimately Devastator Doctrine is going to be the king of this secondary, and the other ones might be a little bit iffy. However, curious to see what people do, and it's certainly one that you can build your list around, which is always a welcome thing to see in a secondary. The second Space Marine secondary that has been adjusted is Oaths of Moment, which has been reverted back to the days of old. Now you get 2 victory points if you have a unit wholly within 6 of the center of the battlefield at the end of the battle round. This was previously 1 victory point. Note that while this is an improvement, it still is end of battle round, so it's going to be highly dependent on that first turn roll off, so it's a bit risky. Let's take a look at the Space Marines that had their secondaries reduced. Starting off with Black Templars, you now have a single bespoke secondary, and it is called Carry Out Your Vows. It's not a bad one if you're going to keep one of them. This is essentially the one that's based off of which vow you have selected, and the end game scoring of this is now going to grant 5 victory points up from 3. Blood Angels were one of the few Space Marines that had extremely powerful and solid secondaries, and we're actually seeing decent tournament wins. Now, unfortunately, you're down to simply Relentless Assault. This is the one in which you get 4 victory points for having more units in your enemy's deployment zone than they have in yours. It's a solid secondary, but losing one of the 2 of the other ones is also going to compound with Blood Angels and losing Armor of Contempt. So I'm curious to see how people adjust. The Dark Angels classic secondary, Stubborn Defiance, is the only remaining survivor from the secondary cull. However, if you're going to keep one, this is the one you want to keep. It still requires you to hold an objective outside of your deployment zone at the start of each command phase, and you get more points the longer you hold on to it. So still kind of a tough secondary, but of the Dark Angels ones, this is the one to hold on to, and I think there's still going to be some play, especially with Terminators. Deathwatch, one of the few codexes that actually had 4 secondaries. They're now reduced to Cull Order. This is the secondary in which you select 3 battlefield roles from your opponent's army, and you get a number of victory points at the end of the battle for each of these categories that you completely wiped out. Previously, this only gave you 4 victory points, maxing out at 12. Now it's going to give you 5 victory points for each battlefield roll, maxing out at 15. I think situationally this is still very strong in certain matchups, and one you're going to be wanting to take a look at. Other than Blood Angels, Space Wolves are the faction with the most interesting and compelling secondaries. Now they're reduced to simply Warrior Pride. This is the secondary in which you get 3 victory points at the end of your turn if you have at least 2 Space Wolf units that completed a charge or ended the turn in combat. It's going to hurt losing some of the other ones, such as Saga and Glory Kills, but ultimately a lot of free warrior is also going to be coming their way, and so I think this is going to help them adjust to the rough secondary situation. The Adeptus Sororitas are an army that have been quite powerful for a number of the reasons, not least of which is their secondaries. They've seen some considerable hits here, however, in a couple of their key secondaries. Sacred Ground now only grants you 4 victory points for completing the action on one of the middle objectives. This is of course down from 5, and this is important in the sense that previously a Sisters player could pretty reliably count on getting base of 11 points, getting 2 of the objectives in mid and 1 in their home base. This now is going to be kind of a base of 9 points, and that's a really big inflection point when you're looking on the reliability of a secondary. Leap of Faith took an even bigger hit than Sacred Ground, and here's how it works. Now at the end of the battle round, you're going to burn a single miracle dice of your choice, and the number of victory points you get depends on the value of that miracle dice. If you discard a 1, a 2, or a 3, you're going to get just a single victory point. If you discard a 4 or a 5, you're going to get 2 victory points. And if you discard a 6, you're going to get 3 victory points. This is particularly devastating because not only do you need to now hope that you can generate a 6, but you also have to then not use it, completely burn it. As an added insult, you still can only get a maximum of 12 points on this secondary. This is a big hit to Sisters on a secondary that was ultimately a free 12 points. Unlike the Sisters of Battle, the Adeptus Mechanicus were known for notoriously bad secondaries, and here we've seen the opposite happen. You still pick an objective outside of your deployment zone that you need to try to control. However, now, instead of being end of battle round, you simply need to control it at the end of your turn, and it gives you 5 victory points. This feels like a very powerful secondary, and one in which you can build around with your amazing and newly improved troop options. Accretion Knowledge is a situational secondary in which you get 3 victory points for killing certain types of units. One of the changes here is vehicles only need to have 8 or more wounds to be eligible, rather than the previous 14. So that's a big boost there. An interesting change, however, is the fact that these kills no longer have to be accomplished by Adeptus Mechanicus units, which is particularly interesting in the era of allied Votann detachments. Food for thought there, and I'm really curious to hear in the comments what y'all think about that. The Astra Malatarum secondaries have got a little bit of a boost here, as well as having the mandatory FAQs being rolled into them. Boots on the ground can now be scored with characters in each table quarter, which is pretty nice, and now you just have to stay outside of 3 inches of the center of the battlefield rather than 6, so much more flexible there. Speaking of flexible, Inflexible Command now is going to give you 2 victory points for killing a unit while under the effects of an order, which is pretty fantastic since it's one of the easier requirements within that secondary. The Imperial Knight secondaries have largely been quite strong, and here, of course, they are one of the few codexes that previously had 4. Now, Duel of Honor is gone, leaving you with ultimately, I think, the stronger secondaries, so not a bad deal here. The Grey Knights see both ends of the adjustments here, with some improvements and some limitations. Destroy the Demon now no longer reduces victory points for surviving demons over a certain threshold, which is always a nice thing to have. Teleport Assault, also famously risky, now grants 5 victory points each time you accomplish it, up from 4. This is a very big deal because you only need to accomplish it 3 times over 5 turns, which is much more reliable than the 4 times you needed to do it before, which left very little wiggle room. The one hit they took is Purifying Ritual, a very powerful secondary, now costs 6 warp charge instead of 5. This seems maybe like a small change here, but I guarantee John's going to start failing those things now, and definitely is going to give some food for thought on how often you can rely on the secondary. The Chaos Space Marines are a faction that have been known to succeed despite their secondaries, and here we see a couple of buffs to them. Rise to Glory no longer requires the kills to be performed only in melee, which is exciting because it's very, very awkward trying to not kill something with Psychic or shooting and trying to get that last hit in with a Crozius or what have you. So a lot more flexibility and a lot more flavorful, I think, for Chaos players in general, letting them be more aggressive. The Long War sees a much needed boost. It now has a cap of 4 per turn. None of the requirements change. This essentially just means you can double down and start banking your points for a turn in which your opponent doesn't give you an objective to take back. So a nice and welcome change there. Now let's take a look at the bespoke Legion secondaries. The Alpha Legion secondary has gone from 0 to hero. Before it was virtually impossible to accomplish because you had to be within 6 inches of your opponent's deployment zone and survive by performing an action until your next command phase. Now, you still need to get to the same spot, but you only have to survive till the end of your turn, making it seem like a veritable 15 points on top of the fact that it still has the ability to corrupt objectives and stop your opponent from scoring them. This seems like a really powerful secondary, and I think is going to overnight transform Alpha Legion and start putting them on competitive tables. Black Legion, of course, is one of my favorite legions, and it sees a welcome buff to its secondary, where you have to perform an action on an objective in the middle. Now, if you're performing this action with troops, it's going to complete at the end of your turn, rather than at your next command phase. Kind of like the Alpha Legion, this is a pretty big change, and it's going to let them compete with secondaries on the same level as factions like Sisters of Battle. The Emperor's Children have been an absolute menace in tournaments, which is why I was surprised to see a buff to their secondary. Previously, you had to kill more characters, kill more units in shooting, kill more units in melee to start scoring points with this secondary. You still have to hold more objectives, but all of these kills only require you to do a single one. It's not comparative with your opponent anymore, which is a huge boon to the army. They did, of course, take away the bonus point for completing all of them, but I think this is a pretty worthwhile trade considering the much lower barrier to entry for scoring. The Iron Warriors Masters of Demolition was a really funny and flavorful secondary, but it was virtually impossible as you couldn't start it on an objective where opponents were standing on it. Now you simply need to control the objective, which is fantastic, and you're also going to get extra victory points for completing the action on the demo site in your opponent's deployment zone. Raid and Reeve is another flavorful secondary, this time for Red Corsairs, that was even harder to accomplish than the Iron Warriors one. You still cannot have enemies on the objective at the start of your command phase, but the action does complete at the end of your turn. What this means is the tactic feels much more like you need to secure an objective, fan out on it, and next turn you can loot it and run away with loot. Still get bonus points for escaping with a unit that performed the action. So really curious to see what people think of this secondary, and I'm curious to hear how you might accomplish it in your list design. The Wordbearer secondary sees a teeny buff. Exalt the Dark Gods now gets you an extra victory point on the first time you complete it. The Death Guard were the first to start receiving free war gear, and they are particularly happy in the Arks of Omen. Here we see a couple of their secondaries get a buff. Fleeting Vectors now gives 2 victory points if you killed 7 or more models with Death Guard units, which is fantastic. And Despoiling Ground, much like Engage in All Fronts, can be accomplished by only staying outside of 3 inches of every other table quarter. It's not particularly good news for the Thousand Suns. Mutate Landscape now has a warp charge of 5, down from 4. Honestly, not the end of the world. I think the bigger hit is Wrath of Magnus is now gone. In some matchups, this was a very solid way to count on getting 15 victory points, and the fact that it's just simply gone is going to be a bit of a hit. Chaos Knights get a bit of a buff in the form of Path of Destruction, in which the No Man's Land kill requirement doesn't require you to also be more than 3 inches away from the deployment zone. So that's gone completely, and you're also going to get a bonus point if you complete all 3, hence also raising the cap to 4 points. Storm of Darkness, of course, includes the FAQ updates from the book version, and also now grants 4 victory points each time you complete it, rather than 3. The Chaos Demons get 1 tiny adjustment to the rule, and it's really fun and flavorful, honestly. It's Despoilers of Reality. Now, after you complete it, you roll the dice, and on a 6+, or a 5+ if the unit had the icon or instrument keyword, you get an extra Warp Storm point. Again, not a huge deal, but it's going to be fun and interesting when it happens. The Asuryani are one of those factions with 4 secondaries, 3 of which are untouched and unchanged. But unfortunately, the hidden path is now removed. However, the good news is a lot of the other core secondaries like Engage in All Fronts and Behind Enemy Lines are fantastic for Eldar, and they're going to be much happier to see those improvements. The Drukhari also had 4 secondaries and lost one of theirs. Beast for the Arena is now gone. I don't think people are shedding too many tears for this particularly niche and difficult secondary. If you watch our other videos or battle reports, you know that the Harlequins have had their saves reduced by 1, and the secondaries also take a hit, although in a much more minor sense. For deadly performance, if you want to complete the requirement by having one of your units in your enemy's deployment zone, that unit now has to be a core unit. So no more Star Reavers, no more characters, no more Void Reavers. Not the end of the world. I think we're looking at more troops, and frankly, more small units of bikes. Weavale now has a base warp charge of 4, up from 3. While it doesn't seem big at first, this means that if you're trying to do this each and every turn, by your final turn, you're now looking for a warp charge 8 cast, and it becomes increasingly risky. Although Tyranids have been an absolute powerhouse, I'm pretty shocked to see that they didn't get any improvements to their secondaries here. In fact, the only change here is an adjustment toning down one of their secondaries. For Synaptic Insight, your Synaptic kill tally now has to be 5 rather than 4, making it a little bit harder to score. Again, kind of surprising given the rest of the changes. We'll see how this one pans out, and let us know how you're trying to score with Tyranids. The Genestealer cults are looking extremely appealing in the new mission pack, and their secondaries are no exception. Ambush sees an improvement where you now get 2 victory points for killing unit with a crossfire marker, which is up from 1, and this of course increases the max of 5 victory points per turn from 4. Sabotage Critical Location also grants a number of extra victory points, increasing 1 for each turn and 2 for the last turn which you complete it. Some pretty exciting changes here, and this faction is looking really good in Arks of Omen. The Necrons have been the boogeyman of the past few months, and their secondaries have been at the core of the problem. we see a couple of adjustments, although I'm not sure how much of an effect it's really going to have. Ancient machineries now can only be completed by core biker, core infantry, or canoptic units. Not a big change, but a change nonetheless. Treasure of Aeons now grants only 4 points for holding 3 of the objectives. I think this is a pretty minor change, honestly, as holding 2 objectives for 3 victory points is an amazing bargain, and many armies would kill to have it. Last but not least, Code of Combat is gone. While not all armies were using this, Silent King builds with Catacomb Command Barge were often counting on it, and they were able to score a number of points within the first couple of turns before the characters died. So this being gone, definitely going to reduce the options for the Necron players out there. Orc secondaries were previously in a pretty solid place. Unfortunately, the biggest and the best is now gone. This was a solid secondary that, while not always particularly high scoring, was very reliable. Green Tide, however, sees an improvement in the sense that you only have to be 3 inches from every other table quarter, much like Engage on the Front, so that's a welcome change, for ultimately a secondary that's scored by very slow units like Grots and Boys and Beast Nagas. So that's pretty fantastic there. Additionally, Get the Good Bits actually sees an improvement. This surprises me as it's already a very powerful secondary if you're building Grots into your list. You're now going to get 4 victory points every time you get the Good Bits, and have a max of 6 victory points per turn. This is an interesting improvement, and it's going to help you score that many points early on before your Grots die. Last but not least, many people have been curious to see what would be done with the Votann secondaries. While a powerful army, their secondaries have often been lacking. And here, to our surprise, there have been absolutely no changes other than Grudge Match being removed, because this is another 4 secondary codex. And that is all the changes to the secondaries in the Arks of Omen GT pack. Hopefully this was helpful. If you want to see more information, we have videos coming out virtually every day where you can learn more about how to play Arks of Omen, how to be a better player, how to play your army. Of course, we want to know how you guys are planning on playing in Arks of Omen. So let us know in the comments below what your game plan is, what you're curious, what you've tried, and what you haven't tried just yet. That's going to do it for me. I'll catch you guys next time on the tabletop. Bye!